It is now my great pleasure to introduce Erin Meezan, Chief Sustainability Officer from Interface, which has been a sustainability pioneer for over 2 decades, as those of us old enough to remember Ray Anderson's iconic speech can attest. As CSO, Erin leads a global team that addresses sustainability at all levels of Interface's business. She's also a frequent lecturer and keynote on sustainable business, and she serves as a guest faculty member at Harvard University. Please welcome Erin to the stage.
Hi everyone, last day, hang in there. I'm here to spend about 10 or 15 minutes telling you a really quick story about something that we kicked off in 2015 at Interface, a little project called the Climate Takeback. And it came out of the fact that I was convinced in 2015 that our company needed to step up our ambition and set much more aggressive goals on climate in the business. And 2 things really influenced me to get there. The first is that I had the privilege of being I had the privilege to attend part of the Paris negotiations. And despite my height, I was invited by the Dutch delegation to be part of the events surrounding kind of the Paris Accord in December of 2015. And while the kind of negotiation of the Paris Accord in 2015 was a huge milestone to be celebrated, what literally started happening the next day was the conversation about the fact that keeping warming to 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, possibly to 1 degree, wasn't enough. And as much as we celebrated, and many of us did, the signing of the Paris Accord the following April, the increasing conversation as plans were being developed was the need to greatly increase our ambition. The second was really the fact that our company had reached a major milestone the year before. I work for a billion-dollar flooring company that's less famous for our products and much more famous for our CEO, who 25 years into the business redesigned the business, transformed it under a vision of sustainability, and really made the cultural change at the business that shifted how we do business and the types of products that we make. And we were coming on sort of reaching the end of an almost 2-decade focus on this mission. We had done everything we could to reduce the footprint of the business. 100% of the energy that we use in US and Europe comes from renewable sources. 96% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. 92% reduction in waste to landfill. And so these 2 kind of moments were hitting us in the sense that it was time to give ourselves a new target and raise our level of ambition, but also the world was asking something greater. And one of the first barriers that we ran into, and for us we're increasingly seeing in our customer base and our employees, is this first barrier of understanding that it is possible to address global warming. It sounds ridiculous, but we've spent more than 3 decades trying to convince people there is a problem and very little time talking about the pathway to solve it. So it's not surprising when we went to our new CEO and said we want to declare a much more ambitious mission at Interface around climate, and we want it to be centered on reversing global warming. And he sort of said, all right, I need to think about that for a little bit. But what I will tell you is that I don't understand as a CEO if it's scientifically possible to do that. I don't see the pathway. I don't understand what a business plan would look like for that, and I don't know where the business opportunity is. But we're a moonshot company. Interface is one of the few companies that's done this before, so I think we have the culture, the innovation, and the people to actually deliver that. So he went ahead in 2016, stood up in front of a room full of our customers and others, and said, we're going to declare that Interface is shifting its focus. And I think what's really important about this is that a company stepped out and said, we're no longer thinking about this false corporate goal of our emissions and our footprint and what we have to do. We're naming the goal we have to have, the world needs to have, which is to create a climate fit for life. And that will drive the mindset and the business strategy that we put in place to do this, right? So we started to build a plan for him, and we started with the science. And we had to do a lot of convincing with our CEO and our senior team to talk about what is the pathway. And we started at the work of Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And while this is a ridiculously complicated graph that I further had to simplify for our senior team, it says 3 really important things. We don't stop at net zero. Company ambitions on climate and strategies have to go well beyond zero because the scientific pathway to solving this is 3 simple things. The first is that gray bit. That's net zero. We have to decrease carbon emissions as quickly as possible across all sectors, right? We all know that. But the other 2 pieces are an equally important part of the strategy. The yellow and the orange bar that's called human carbon sinks. That's all about carbon removal. The second part of solving this is we have to remove all the excess carbon that's already in the atmosphere through new technologies, through direct air capture, through better agriculture, through protection, through new innovation, removing that carbon from the atmosphere, using more biomaterials to make buildings and products. And then the green and the blue is we have to do those 2 things. Stop putting more up there and get to zero as quickly as possible and start actively removing that. We have to do those things while we're equally protecting and enhancing the existing sinks on the planet. So once we explained that to our CEO and our senior team, the next step was to actually break it down another level and say if we had a business approach to doing this, these are the components of our business strategy. We have to continue to radically decarbonize Interface and its supply chain as a business. And as a billion-dollar flooring manufacturer, for us, that means really changing the supply chain and the people who make our materials. We have to find ways as a product manufacturer to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And the third way is we have to do all of that while protecting those important natural sinks. So we wrote a plan. We put it on our website. You can download it. We've actively been sharing it with our competitors, with our customers, and others in the built environment space. And one of the most important things we learned in going through this process was that in order to create a business strategy, we needed to map that science against our plan. So the first part for us was continuing to focus on decarbonize the business. The second part we call love carbon, and it was really about finding ways that we can utilize low carbon materials, carbon negative materials in our products, in the manufacture of our products. The third we already talked about, which is protecting those natural buffers. But the last part is really important too, because we are just $1 billion company and only about 5,000 employees around the world. The most important thing that Interface can do is first model this behavior and what it actually looks like. But the second is engage the rest of the people in the built environment space. So this idea of leading the industrial revolution for us actually means bringing that learning to our customers. It means changing policies and engaging in advocacy. One of the really interesting things we've decided to do this year is hire a lobbying firm in the state of California and expand California's Buy Clean law that was passed in 2017. That's a piece of legislation that says as the state of California is doing new construction projects, they have to consider the embodied carbon of those construction materials. They have to make better decisions, right? So we're actively looking to expand that to include all of the interiors products and buildings. That's what it means by leading an industrial re-revolution. We've also created a coalition of other manufacturers who sell products in the built environment space. Insulation, drywall, flooring, all of the pieces and components you see in this room have a carbon footprint associated with them, and many times that can be half of the carbon associated with the entire space, right? So we've got to sort of bring together a coalition of manufacturers, find a way to actually drive this and make it a reality. So this is the plan and the strategy that Interface follows when we try to achieve a stated goal that we've put out there, which is to be a carbon negative company across all 3 scopes of our business, including our supply chain, by 2040. So that means we'll continue to decarbonize the products and the operations. Right now, all of the products that we make around the world are actually climate neutral as a standard attribute. I'll talk a little bit about a new product innovation that we have coming that actually loves carbon in a minute. And when we think about, okay, so the vision is science, our business strategy must follow that. What will it look like in operation to actually put this in place in a business? And for us, it's a lot of the commitments that businesses have already made. When we think about living zero, it's all of those strategies we're already doing to decarbonize, whether that's efficiency in our factories, whether that's using new materials, whether it's increasingly recycling and bringing our products back, whether it's looking at resource-efficient transportation, all of the things that we've already talked about to date, right? But the second piece of that, moving to carbon removal, is finding a way as a product manufacturer to actually use this to create new products, whether that's looking at using biomaterials that in and of themselves store much carbon than perhaps a petroleum-derived material, whether that's actually capturing durable carbon from the atmosphere and using that to make plastics or energy to run operations. It's that sort of lens that we have to use and develop and really build on the ability to exercise the ability to sort of remove carbon from the atmosphere as a business. So this is a really exciting thing that we're going to announce in May. As a maker of flooring products and carpet tiles and rubber, this is our medium. And I think actually what's really funny about this slide is, I can't see it from here, but I think on the very bottom it says internal use only, may not be used externally until approved by the marketing team. I love that. Just so you know, I have approval. And frankly, the lesson for the marketing team is you don't give something to the chief sustainability officer if you don't want it to be shown publicly. I just noticed that last night. But as a maker of flooring products and carpet tiles, I mean, this is where rubber meets the road in terms of loving carbon. What does it actually look like to integrate that? Our canvas, our medium, and what we're working on to achieve this is really going to be focused on products and operations. So when we say we want to remove more carbon from the atmosphere than the business emits, that means we're looking at strategies at the factory level to go beyond a zero carbon factory, and we're looking at what can we do in our factories to actually sequester and store carbon. Is that terrestrial sequestration? Is it green roofs? Is it removing all the parking lots we have and planting grass? Is it different goals and targets, right? That's a small part of it, but the biggest piece as a product manufacturer and our medium is our products. So this year we will announce the ability to make and produce the world's first carbon negative carpet tile. When measured, the materials, which is the biggest part of the carbon footprint of a product, themselves are carbon neutral, enough to offset the energy made to manufacture it. And we've been on a 5-year journey to do this. So I said we started in 2015. In 2016, we announced this mission. In 2017, we challenged our innovation team to create a carpet tile that loves carbon, that throughout the footprint of the entire process, that would be a net carbon negative carpet tile, and launch a prototype in the market, because we wanted to do two things. We wanted to wake up the built environment space to the fact that we need to go beyond low carbon and carbon neutral, and that the future is really carbon negative products. But we also wanted to sort of show our competitors and our company itself what was possible. So we launched a prototype in the market in 2017. In 2018, we commercialized the backing component of that. Last year, we spent about $50 million to change the backing lines in all of our factories around the world to have the capability to produce carbon negative products. And despite the marketing team not wanting me to announce it here, in a couple of months, we will announce that we have put the world's first carbon negative carpet tile out there. In and of itself, flooring, may not get everybody in this room out of bed every morning, but it's not the flooring itself, it's the idea of what's possible. The second we introduce a carbon negative carpet tile into the built environment space, we are starting to work with our customers to change what they ask for, to change their specifications. When the state of California sees that it's possible to buy carbon negative carpet, they're going to start asking our competitors for that. They're going to start asking lighting companies and drywall companies and insulation manufacturers and furniture companies where their carbon negative products are. We're going to build carbon negative into market mechanisms like LEED and WELL, and we're going to continue to influence what the built environment space looks like. And for those of you who don't work in my industry or the built environment space, added up, it's about 40% of global carbon emissions. So as much as we want to talk about transportation and energy, let's not forget buildings. Let's not forget building construction, and the construction of all of the materials that goes into those spaces is a significant part of the carbon. And the way you see that, we break it out in terms of embodied carbon and operational carbon. When you turn on the lights in a building and you turn on the HVAC and you start plugging in your computers, that's operational carbon. When you are building the building and you are looking at the carbon emissions associated with the wood, the concrete, the steel, that's embodied carbon. And the interesting thing about interiors is when you sit in a room like this, oftentimes the flooring is the most significant part of the embodied carbon in the interiors. Why? Because we use high-performing engineered materials like nylon. And to the extent that we can show customers where that carbon is in the built environment and allow them to make choices, we will be doing our part to actually not just shift the footprint of our business, but to actually change the entire built environment space. And so I will leave you guys with this. It's been a 5-year journey for us that started because we changed our mindset. We adopted a much more ambitious goal that, frankly, most companies know is coming. So if you're in a business, if you purchase products, if you're running sustainability for an organization, I want you to really think about what your carbon negative carpet tile is, what your 5-year plan is to get to carbon negative, and what you're going to take from this conference and go implement back in your business that's equivalent to the level of ambition that we need to save the planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erin. It's super exciting to see the new frontiers of climate leadership. So I now like to ask the final member of our triumvirate to the stage to join us for our final conversation of the conference. Welcome Mark Webb, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer at Dominion Energy.
Thank you.
So yes, I am. I'm on. So why don't you kick us off, Mark, and tell us a little bit more about your work at Dominion?
So I'll talk a little bit. I know Diane just spoke and talked about our corporate goals that we've just announced, so I don't want to rehash that. But one of the ways that we expect to be able to meet those targets is the link between energy of the future and sustainability is through innovation. And so what we're looking at is through our innovation efforts, we're focused on across the board, all the things you've heard about, from decentralized resources, decarbonization of transportation, and interesting, we're very focused, and Stephen Harper mentioned, is the growth of exponential data and digitalization, how that may drive our ability to meet those targets. So through that and through those focus areas, we have really focused in terms of transportation as an example, in terms of decarbonizing it. It's led to some of our initiatives that have been referenced here, from electric school buses, piloting an autonomous shuttle. But those are the drivers for us as we look at, we believe that there are many things out there that we can do as we progress innovation, not just by us. As a utility, we apply innovation. We take others' innovations and apply them in ways that we can better deliver the energy that our customers use to power their lives, to power their cities, to power their businesses. But with that, we have this effect on sustainability, and it's intertwined with innovation, and innovation will be the driver.
Great. We're going to come back to innovation. But I wanted to start with a question around ambition. So since COP25, if not before, there's been a lot of conversation about how to ratchet up ambition, how to ratchet up climate action for all sorts of good reasons. Each of your organizations have incredibly impressive climate goals. So can you tell us a little bit about how you've engaged with the senior leadership team? How did you get buy-in? How did you increase their ambition around the commitments and priorities?
So from my perspective, I didn't have to engage the senior leadership team.
Right.
It starts with our CEO, and he is engaged.
Yeah.
It's the number one focus, and he set the agenda, and we're all engaged. And with that support, it is every time he speaks to employees, he talks about our goals, the turn that the company is making, and the way we deliver energy, and that's driving it. And when you have that behind you, people are very receptive. And it enables us to go through the organization at every level and seek to create a culture that is very different for a utility.
Yeah.
We operate multiple utilities in 18 states. Innovation has not always been the goal of utilities. It's been low cost and reliable service,
Yep.
Whether it's electric or gas. But when you start to talk about innovation, and that they know that part of the goal of innovation is to reduce emissions, be it carbon or methane, the idea is, and you start a forum and a way to take ideas from procedures, the big and the small. It's amazing the effect it has when you, throughout the organization, when there is a clear direction set from the top in terms of this is our goal, this is what will guide our strategy for the coming 5 years, 10 years, and 30 years.
Great, and I suspect you have a very similar perspective, Erin. Probably haven't had to do a ton of engagement at the
Well,
senior
it's
levels.
interesting. I mean, I had a new CEO to Interface who wasn't exactly a sustainability champion in his prior life, and certainly wasn't ready to sign up the first day I went to him and said, we think the new mission of the company is to reverse global warming. He wasn't ready for that, quite simply. And I think lots of CEOs are in that place. They think our company has to have a response to climate. Maybe we want to be in a leadership position. But I fundamentally think that many CEOs would tell you exactly what mine was able to articulate, which I think took a lot of confidence, which is to say, I actually don't think this is scientifically possible. I don't understand how we can store enough carbon to get the Earth back on track. I mean, I think that was a very astute observation, and the fact that he was able to articulate that being a big barrier was important. I think the second thing he said, which is what any other CEO would say, is, I don't understand how this helps the business. What is the business pathway to actually getting there? So we actually did a couple of things with him. We brought in some outside environmental advisors, and we had a very small meeting that was not the senior leadership team, that was not everyone in the world. It was about 10 people in our company, including our CEO, and we talked about that science that I showed you. And we had deep conversations about what carbon removal actually means and what it would mean in the context of a product manufacturer, meaning we would have to find new raw materials, we would have to build a new supply chain, we would have to get customers to buy it, we would have to market the hell out of it and change market mechanisms and pulls. And when we were able to have that conversation, he was one step further. And I think the other thing that really influenced it was the early wave of kind of the citizen movement starting to happen and what we were hearing at companies like Amazon. So if I were in the seat now convincing a new CEO, I would be sharing that information with my CEO saying, here's a company who actually has a business pathway. That's why we made our plan public. That's why it's on our website. And companies have reached out to us and said, could you come and talk to our senior leadership team about what it actually looks like? I'd be sending my CEO the commitments that companies like Microsoft have made and said, actually, this is what leadership looks like. Net zero, not enough anymore. And if we're only at net zero, man, we are far behind. I would get him in other spaces with other CEOs who are able to have that closed door conversation and talk about the business opportunity, because our company firmly believes that those carbon negative products are going to differentiate us, we're going to win specifications, and we're going to make more money than our competitors. And I think it's important for a CEO to tell other CEOs that.
Yeah. Well, as you say, there are a lot of examples right now. Larry Fink's letter to CEOs, right? Powerful signal. Shout out to fellow Canadian Mark Carney and his work with the Bank of England and soon to be UN. So that's great. So related question around the sort of the story, the evolving story of sustainability and climate. We sort of started this conversation in the green room and where the function, the sustainability and climate function should sit optimally. So it started, as we all know, from a place of compliance, managing regulatory risk, the lawyers were handling it, et cetera. Moved into sort of the space that I work in, communications, reputational risk. And now it's sort of really kind of, it's all over the place. So I spoke with someone, I think yesterday, whose most senior sustainability person was heading up their investor relations function. You've got someone in the C-suite here, a senior executive who's got innovation in their title. So what do you, is there an optimal place for the function, particularly given we need kind of systems thinking to get to some of the solutions and the changes that we need? Do you want to start, Erin?
I think if you want to influence the strategy of the company, which is where it all needs to be, it needs to be in the C-suite. Yeah. And whether or not it's combined with sustainability and innovation, I think really falls down to what kind of company you actually are. Yeah. But I don't think it can be in the communications function. I think it needs to be fundamentally built into the strategy of a business, and we need to depend on it helping to be a part of the growth of that business, right?
Yep.
And I think for us, it is in the C-suite. I think we look at it as that it is every leader's responsibility.
Yeah.
And every employee's. I mean, when you focus employees on our commitments, and that there's a new driver, and that in terms of every project they look at, they now have a lens that in addition to ROI or improvement in customer efficiency or reliability, they're also thinking about the emissions. Or the cross-sustainability efforts in terms of water usage. They think across the board. And that comes from the top. It comes from the business unit heads. And everyone thinks that way. I think in terms of the C-suite, we're really just the quarterbacks. With innovation, we're directing it, but innovation occurs in each of the business units too, and primarily. They're the ones who are driving it. Sustainability is the same way. A corporate sustainability officer is, analyzing the targets, analyzing the science and how you calculate the targets. But at a high level, every single business unit is focused on how they're going to meet the expectations.
So is that embedded in performance targets? Is that embedded in the purpose of the organization? How does it manifest? It's
certainly embedded in the purpose, and I think as we are, in terms of how it is embedded in performance targets, it's evolving,
right.
But
yep.
I think in some way, shape, or form, we'll get there, whether it's in
yep.
terms of concrete projects that lead to it, or in terms of parameters.
Yeah.
It's similar to what we did years ago. We began an initiative on safety, and this becomes everyone's responsibility. And when it's a corporate goal, goals get met. And that's the way it works in a corporation. So when it becomes a goal, it gets met. And I think people, and this is a goal that people really, the reception from employees has been, there's been a hunger. People live in the communities, they see it, and people want it. And I think there's never been a more positive or turn for our company in terms of the reception from employees than the commitments that we're making on the climate and sustainability overall.
Great. Well, that's a good segue to the next question I'd love to ask. So we've talked a little bit about your influence within an organization. So can you talk a little bit about that influence sort of beyond, well, with your employees potentially? Mark, you sort of as part of a public utility, you're in a unique position to influence customer behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that we, obviously public utilities have a different role in that they were created for specific purposes to ensure that there is energy delivered that powers the economy, that makes our cities operate as we know that as they operate today. And they had a goal. It was do it cheaply, serve everyone, and do it reliably. I think as we tackle the challenges, all those things still must be met. We serve everyone. It has to be affordable, it has to be reliable, but sustainability and the climate is ideally suited for the model of a public service corporation that was designed to serve everyone and to accomplish large societal goals.
Yeah.
And so obviously when we deliver renewable electricity or a much cleaner and far lower emissions natural gas to someone who heats their home with natural gas, they're immediately more sustainable. And it helps someone like Interface meet their targets. But we can even go beyond that, and that in terms of the impact and the counter impacts that we can have, the pancaking effects, the school bus example.
Yeah.
And that if we can look at that and say, we can look at batteries as a resource. They can power transportation, they can power the grid, or sometimes they can do both. And so we began looking at at transportation in the school buses as a unique application for buses that were idle half of the year, 180 days a year, ran predictable schedules, is stored at the exact same place every single day, runs known schedules, runs known miles every day on the routes. It's a perfect opportunity to begin deploying the vehicle-to-grid technology and to get a usage from a battery that both serves the grid and powers a school bus and takes kids to school without diesel emissions, which cleans the air inside the bus for kids. The win-win-win effect of the things that we can do as a public utility, because we're starting with one goal. It has the pancaking effect in ways that not every other industry has.
Well, and the educational impact of sending those buses out into the community as well, I assume, it's pretty big.
It's tremendous. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that it's, the reception for that from parents in particular has been overwhelming.
Well, we know the kids are the ones telling their parents, right? They need to do
Right.
something about this. I know mine are. Erin, you guys are doing such amazingly innovative things with your product, and I'm guessing that has a big impact for your supply chain. So can you talk a little bit about your influence there?
Sure. I think it's kind of two ends of it. The first is really on the supply chain where, we started 20 years ago introducing ideas of sustainability. We've done different things to engage the supply chain, some of which is shifting our purchasing power as a result of an innovation challenge. So 15 years ago, we said to our 3 primary nylon suppliers, we split our business between 3 of you. The first one of you who can give us a recycled content nylon, we're going to give you the bulk of our business. When we wanted to push them even further to sort of show them what a social enterprise model looked like, we actually created a pilot project in the Philippines where we worked with local communities to harvest ghost fishing nets, gave them a wage for the harvesting and the processing, and then showed that to our supply chain. And the interesting thing about that is we had been talking to our suppliers for years about how do we go beyond environmental sustainability to social, and it was an abstract concept. So when we funded a small pilot project, when it started to get amazing PR, everyone suddenly got interested in those models. So sometimes it's been a purchasing power approach, sometimes it's been funding an innovation pilot, but I think the bigger power we have now is in our customer base. And so we've spent a lot of time over the last year educating our architects and designers, the universities and the big corporates who purchase the flooring products to really understand how much carbon is in a building. And we do that by asking our salespeople to go out and not just present products, but give a talk on embodied carbon. Almost like a continuing education credit, they do that. We've actually funded tools that are now launching in the built environment space where designers and others picking products can compare the carbon footprints of interior materials against each other and pick the lowest option. That's called the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator tool. It's free, it's online, it plugs into a lot of building software. And so this idea of first we have to build awareness, then we have to build the tools, then the next step is we're now working with several kind of green building standards to incorporate the idea of carbon negative as an innovation credit for products. So I think we're learning that if we want to scale this as quickly as possible, if we want to see the impact over the next 10 years, we can't just design the products.
Yeah.
We have to create the demand and be a part of doing that.
Yeah, that's great. I've got a couple more questions, but I'm also aware that folks in the audience might have some, and I want to give them the chance because I know we're rapidly running out of the time. I can't see anything, but does anybody have a question?
It's impossible to see.
Oh, one over there.
Erin, amazing work, and congrats on your Fearless Leadership nomination from Sustainable Brands. Everyone check that out for Women's Day in 2 days, right? So I hear you completely on the business case, but I feel like the built environment has a much larger incentive to do initiatives like you're doing in terms of having those C-suite conversations, because there's so much incentivization around lead credits and stuff. So what about other companies, consumer product companies, where there's not a direct, immediate way to, if it does result in a higher cost product or a higher cost to the business, like, do you have any high level recommendations? I know there's lots of different sectors and nuances there.
I think, I take that as fair. The built environment, has gone through a revolution in the last 2 decades as green buildings and all of the certification systems have come online that allows us to plug into these market mechanisms for sure. But I think the same is true on the consumer side. I mean, what drove that transformation in the built environment was actually building awareness early on with architects and designers about the damage associated with the decisions they were making on bad design or high energy design or building boxes in places that fundamentally had negative impacts on the places they were building them. And so what started all that was, awareness building around the impact of good design. And I think there's a parallel there on the consumer side, which, a lot of the strategies around building awareness could be deployed. But one thing that needs to happen, that happened in the built environment space, was you had companies coming together with a really clear common message. What we hear on the consumer side of the business is like, there's too many messages, there's too many labels, I don't understand what's the best thing to do. And as much as I, don't relish the idea of government regulation, it may be a really good time for the FDA or others to step in, whether it's in the food sector or others, and very clearly define and start to clean up what's a most sustainable, what's a sort of not sustainable, and what's a choice you can make, whether that's by, adding to the nutrition label, whether that's a fundamentally different system. I mean, I kind of feel like it could help. We're to the point in the consumer sector where there's too many confusing messages. The other thing I think could happen is consumer companies could align. And you see some of this in the outdoor apparel industry, and I think Patagonia has been fantastic on their leadership, and they have driven that sector to align behind them. that could happen in the food sector. And to a certain extent, Stonyfield has driven some of that and done some work in the early days. But I think the government could get involved. I think we could see much more collaboration amongst consumer-facing products that could develop either a clear and unified certification label, more information. What we also do in the built environment space is we issue something called environmental product declarations, which are like nutrition labels for the products. Some consumer version of that, I think, could be really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. And is there any other question? One more question I think we have time for? Can't see.
God, it's so bright up here. There's one right there.
Junko Suba from Steinberg Asset Management. I have a question to Erin. Thank you so much for sharing your initiatives, and clearly a market leader. I'm curious to understand if the financial markets, you feel that the financial markets reward you for the things that you do today, because you're clearly a leader, you're having an impact today, you're definitely going to have an impact into the future. Do you feel that that value has been translated into financial value, particularly in terms of your market valuation? I guess I could ask that of Dominion Energy as well, so thank you.
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say no. I feel like it should be reflected in a higher stock value. But what's been a really interesting disconnect is, even though BlackRock is kind of one of the biggest ones, one of our biggest investors consistently, what I find and what I hear from my colleagues in the built environment sector is the BlackRock letter comes out, but the day-to-day interaction we have with the BlackRock investors who work with our IR team, there isn't necessarily a strong connection there. So rarely are those people on calls talking about or asking about how quickly we're going to decarbonize the business. We just announced 2 weeks ago this $50 million investment in changing over technology globally. Not one investor on the call asked about it. Not one investor said, wow, that's an amazing step forward. I can actually see the value associated with you decarbonizing. You're in sort of the built environment space. I just don't think we see the connection at all. What I think is encouraging, though, is the growth of investors starting to look at those ESG scores. 5 years ago, no one would ask us what our number was. And we are actually starting to see investors ask, how did you score on this? We're having to increase our efforts with investors to talk about that proactively, so I think that's a good sign.
Mark, do you want to?
Yeah, I think, for us, it's very hard to attribute particular fluctuations in the stock price or value to any one thing. Certainly, we have a lot of investors who are where ESG type or even just some commitment on those things are very important to them. And they wouldn't be investors if we didn't pursue it. I think as again, just from operating as public utilities in different states and different companies, commitments that we're making and going beyond what may be required by a federal law or a federal statute, it's making your business sustainable as a business for the long term. So I think the expectation is there. It drives long-term value because anyone looking into the horizon knows that the path may not be entirely clear, but you know that over this time horizon, you've got to transform and you have to be there. And if you're not doing it, I think there would be a penalty.
Thank you. Well, since this is the last question and answer for the entire conference, let's go out. Let's go out on a high note. So this is my favorite question, and I do apologize, but I like we deal with a lot of tough information, and so I want to hear from you both. What is giving you the most hope and the most inspiration as you look towards the next decade? Do you want to start, Mark?
Sure, I'll start. I just think in terms of what gives me hope, I think, is that as the innovation officer, we have all kinds of companies who come to us with ideas. And the hope is that market economics works. The number of companies out there who are focused on things like storage goes beyond lithium ion, it goes beyond into using materials that are far more sustainable. There's an idea presented every day in terms that leads to a more sustainable energy grid. Mm-hmm. So entrepreneurialism works, market economics works, it's driving innovation. People see a need and they respond. So I think that gives me hope. But in terms of inspiration, I think what has inspired me is our own employees and the way they've responded. When we set these goals, to see how it permeates every level in terms of the way people think. We've got meter readers people who change gas meters at homes who come up with new processes that reduces methane leakage during a change out of a meter. When we have a meter reader who comes up with a new way to keep a meter from freezing during the wintertime, and instead of using fiberglass, he proposed using a denim-based material that's reusable, so that you wouldn't send the fiberglass to the landfill every year. It shows you that to the very, throughout the organizations, the message is out there, because he was thinking about safety, he was thinking about sustainability, and he was thinking about reliability, all at the same time. And when you see that, you know that what you're doing is resonating. And I think that the response from employees, they were waiting. And they want to do it, and they want to do what they can, because they live in these communities too. They live in their states, and so they want to respond, and they feel that they can, and now they're empowered to do it.
And there's an alignment of personal and professional priorities.
There's an alignment.
Yeah, powerful. That's amazing. Erin?
I think two things. The conversation has definitely shifted in the last 5 years in the built environment space where I am, from this idea of acceptance that net zero is not enough. And how companies are quickly responding to go beyond that is great. And I think the second is, we've never engaged a lobbying firm or done policy work at our company before. And it's been incredibly hopeful for me to see that in a 6-month time span, we found a lobbyist, identified a way that we could scale a solution on embodied carbon with the state of California, actually got a legislator to meet with us, the guy who sponsored the first bill, actually agreed to sponsor amending it, and it's actually moving. And maybe it's because I don't work in politics and I have a perception of it, but I'm incredibly encouraged that change can happen quickly. And we may not get it passed this year, but I think the idea that it exists and that we can now show other states and other legislatures what's happening, that's incredibly encouraging to me.
Great. Well, I think that's a great note to go out on. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing what you do next. Can you please join me in thanking Mark and Erin?